Chapter 12. 2 weeks before the armed robbers wrote us a letter, a new salon was set up right beside mine. The owner was Iabolu, a fat illiterate who belched in between her words. If she said good morning to you, you got an accurate idea of what she had eaten for breakfast, along with a spray of spit that followed every word she spoke. Children spilled out of her salon like water from a fountain and littered the passageway that we shared. They were all over the place, crawling, sitting, or lying about. They were all little girls with dirty hair. The oldest was about 10 and the youngest about 4. 6 daughters in 6 years. I disliked the woman so much in the first week after she arrived that in a wild moment I considered moving my salon to another location. Iabolu was always shouting at her daughters, and the few customers she had went home with more spittle in their hair than setting lotion. She had about 2 customers each day, and sometimes none at all. As much as she tried to lure my customers by greeting them with too many words and very wide smiles, the spittle fountain that was her mouth must have put them off. She was soon spending a lot of time in my salon. She would come in shortly before noon so that she could listen to the midday news on my radio. The radio was not just old, it had become temperamental. Sometimes to get clear reception, Iabolu would need to stand beside it and hold the antenna. Once the news was over, she'd settle in a chair that squeaked under her weight and dispense unsolicited styling advice. It was Iabolu who brought me the letter her family had received from the armed robbers. Her family lived on our estate, and every family in the estate had received a letter from the thieves. She asked me to read her letter to her after the customers and stylists had left. The letter was in the same format as the one addressed to us, only the address and salutation were different. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Adio, we greet you in the name of the gone. We write to inform you that we will visit your family before the end of this year. Prepare a package for us. We accept a minimum amount of 1,000 naira. We will give you time to gather this money. We will write you again to tell you the specific date of our visit. Is that all? Iabolu asked. Yes. She frowned. I must think about this matter. Where do they want us to find that kind of money? It's enough to buy a car. I am sure it is a joke. It is just a stupid prank, Jerry, I said. This was long before that kind of thing became a regular occurrence. I could not imagine then that one day in Nigeria, thieves would be bold enough to write letters so that victims could prepare for their attacks, that one day they would sit in living rooms after raping women and children and ask people to prepare pounded yam in a goosey stew while they watched movies on VCRs that they would soon disconnect and cart away. Only a few people like Iabolu believed the letter was real. I attributed this to her lack of formal education. I didn't think much about the first letter. I didn't even show it to Akin. There were other things on my mind. After Fumi moved in, I began seeing a psychiatrist on Wednesdays. I'd never heard of pseudosciasis until then, and though it sounded to me like a made-up word, I went for my appointment every week, and my body began to revert gradually to its normal size. I took to walking to and from work because my psychiatrist recommended exercise. I actually found it calming to walk the short distance, away from Fumi and back to her. I tried to focus on my salon, but it was hard not to notice the changes she was making in the sitting room. She moved the chairs around and placed a vase of plastic flowers on the center table. I did my best to avoid running into her and spent most of my time upstairs. Akin was busy at work and usually came in after I was fast asleep. But during the weekends, he wanted to talk about how my treatment was going. To make him happy, I assured him that I no longer had days or even moments when I believed I was pregnant. Iabolu became a permanent fixture in my salon. She slept through the working hours, snoring through her open mouth while her daughters roamed around, getting up only to stand by the radio when the news came on. When we got the follow-up letters from the armed robbers, The days began to speed along like a video cassette on fast forward. These letters were different from the initial ones. They were not identical notes that a bored teenager could have cooked up. They were personalized, addressed to each family by people who had to have been watching us, studying us, and perhaps living amongst us. The robbers congratulated the Agumbiades on the birth of their twin daughters. They congratulated the Ojos on the brand-new Peugeot 504 station wagon they had just bought, consoled the Fatolas on the loss of their chieftaincy title, and advised the Adios, Iabolu's family, to consider family planning. They promised to show up within 3 weeks, advised everyone not to move out of the estate, and promised to hunt us down if we dared move. They knew so much about us that we believed they would find us if we tried to run away from the estate. Our hearts stopped beating and began to thump loud rhythms. We jumped when rats scurried by and stopped taking evening strolls. Even children were less noisy. The estate committee employed a group of hunters to guard the estate. There had been no estate committee before the threats. We were all so educated and modern in our individual duplexes, honking hello when we drove by each other in town. We visited when it was necessary, for naming ceremonies, birthdays, and the occasional funeral. But we did not send pounded yam and egusi stew in enamel bowls to each other at Christmas, or distribute fried ram at Ileya. Instead, we wished each other Merry Christmas and Ramadan Kareem, without leaving our porches, and waved as we got into our cars or went into our houses. Yet once the second set of letters from the thieves arrived, an estate committee was formed. Everyone in the estate joined. The first official meeting was rowdy, but we managed to agree to employ 5 policemen and a group of hunters to join the security guards. We also decided to pay 3 naira per household as security due. Akin and Mr. Adio were dispatched to Ayeso police station immediately to request that policemen be sent down to us. The committee got a letter the next day from the robbers. They wrote that the police were on their payroll. We laughed at this and nodded in agreement at the committee meeting when Mr. Fatola, ex-Chief Fatola, said we had outwitted the robbers and their last letter was evidence to that effect. The policemen resumed duty within the next week. The sight of policemen with automatic pistols and hunters with Dane guns patrolling the estate reassured us, and we soon forgot about the letters. Then, Iabolu called a Women of the Estate meeting. It was the first time I had entered Iabolu's home. I was surprised to discover that it was so clean and tidy. From what I saw of Iabolu at the salon, I had expected her sitting room to stink of caked urine and be littered with used nappies. Instead, it smelled tangy and fresh like lime. I could tell from the way the other women looked around that they had expected something similar. None of her children surfaced throughout the meeting. I kept wondering if she had hidden them in a room or in a shoe cupboard. Iabolu started the meeting once the last woman was seated.
We must be ready for the thieves. These people rape. They rape children. We must be armed with sanitary pads.
Her eyes opened wider with each word until they looked like they might pop out and roll under a chair.
With sanitary pads? Do they put bullets in them now?
Mrs. Fatola said, shaking her head. One person laughed. Then another, and soon we were all laughing except Iabolu, who looked as if she might begin to cry.
Shut your mouths!
Iabolu screamed.
I have 6 daughters. Do you know what that means? The oldest one is already growing breasts. Some of you have daughters too. Daughters already seeing their monthly things. Anything can happen with those thieves. How what about you yourselves? How many of your husbands will take a bullet rather than have a group of robbers rape you? I am sure they are finding a way to hide in the ceiling.
There are no thieves coming. We have policemen, Mrs. Ojo said. She had studied in England for a year, and she always spoke in a fake British accent, even when she was speaking in Yoruba.
Yes, there is no need to scare ourselves over nothing,
I said. Mrs. Fatola applauded. Nobody else joined in the applause.
Iabolu hissed, Let me say my own. Soak the sanitary pads in red wine, or liquid from boiled zobo leaves. Wear it every night in case these people come, so that if they come, they will think you are seeing your monthly thing.
Is this woman crazy? Even if she is right, all the women in a holy state menstruating at the same time, who would believe that? Mrs. Ojo said in English, with her strangled British accent. Mrs. Fatola shook her head and got up. It's her illiteracy, an impoverished mind, I must say, Mrs. Ojo said. I don't have time for this. I need to get to work, Mrs. Fatola said.
What are they saying?
Iyabolu asked me. That there is nothing to worry about. Just relax, I said to her in Yoruba. We have the police.
Tell me, did the police help Dele Giwa?
Iyabolu asked. Mrs. Fatola fell in her chair as though pushed back by the weight of Iyabolu's words. The room was quiet, and Mrs. Ojo glanced about as though afraid there was a Secret Service agent listening in on our conversation. In the months after Dele Giwa had been assassinated, rooms would fall silent with fear whenever his name was mentioned. It did not matter that none of the women in Iyabolu's sitting room was editor-in-chief of a news magazine. Giwa's fate still felt like something that could befall any of us, because the bomb that killed him was delivered to his home in a parcel. Receiving a parcel was such an innocuous everyday thing, and we could all imagine sitting at a desk in our home to cut one open. And though I could not imagine my parcel with a sticker that bore the Nigerian coat of arms and the inscription, "From the office of the C&C," I knew that if, like Giwa's son, I had received similar packages in the past for my father from the head of state, I would not hesitate to take it to him in his study. When Giwa, who was with a colleague, received the parcel, he said, "This must be from the president," and opened it after his son left the study. He died in a hospital later that day, though his injured colleague survived. To be honest, Mrs. Fatola said, I ask the housemaid to open our letters now, even the ones from these so-called robbers. I had taken no precautions with the letters my family received. When Dele Giwa was killed, I was busy spending my time indoors, conserving my energy, so I would be strong enough to push when the baby came. I was paying no attention to the news. By the time I returned to work, Giwa's death had taught Nigeria to be afraid of her leaders. But probably, because I learnt about the events in retrospect, I was not terrified enough to stop opening my own letters. At the salon, Iyabolu pestered me for the wording of my family's letter. She went around asking all the women for the details of their letters, then sat in my salon, trying to figure out what the robbers might want from each family. She seemed to care about protecting us all from what she saw as impending doom. She really cared. I told her the details of the letter addressed to Akin and me. The robbers told us not to leave the estate for Fumi's flat in an attempt to avoid them.
How come they know your rival's house? I tell you they are real. They are going to come,
Iyabolu said. The woman was so scared. Sometimes I was touched by her concern. At other times her fears irritated me. Didn't she see policemen standing guard in the estate? Chapter 13. My husband's brother was one of those men who won an argument because he could yell louder and longer than everyone else, even if his view was stupid. He also had a way of twisting his neck around as far as it could go in the heat of an argument. It gave the impression that he might strangle himself to death if his audience did not agree with him. Most people eventually did. I always thought they let him have his say and his way because they did not want to be responsible for his death. I did not like my brother-in-law. But then I was married to Akin, and Dotun came as part of the package. Whenever Dotun came to visit, I was glad that he lived in Lagos and his visits were spaced out enough to give me breathing room. He was always telling all sorts of strange jokes that were not funny at all. He laughed so loudly, too loudly, at his own mirthless jokes. It was tiring to be around him. I always had to laugh at things that were not funny. I also had to figure out when I was supposed to laugh, as his jokes had no detectable punchline. He was not a man to be taken seriously amidst all that laughter. He made many promises, promises he would never keep. Dotung had promised us a child once. He'd said he would send one of his sons to live with us until I conceived. When he said it, I went on my knees and thanked him. Maomi had suggested months before that I look for a child, a toddler who could live with me until I conceived. She'd said that children have a way of calling other children into the world. Having a foster child's voice around me constantly would call up my own children, hurry them along into the world. The only problem was that I had no full siblings, and I hadn't spoken to my half-siblings in years. I had no relative who would entrust me with their child. I forgot about the idea until Dotung somehow got to hear about it and promised to send his youngest son. The boy's name was Lai. He was 2 years old at the time. I furnished a room for him upstairs. I bought toys, picture books, drawing books and colouring pencils. I waited. The items in the room became dusty. I waited, dusted each toy and each book with a soft cloth. I asked Akin to call his brother and follow up. The items gathered more dust. Akin told me that Dotung had changed his mind. I packed up all the toys and gave them away. Yet, I was glad when Dotung showed up on our doorstep one Saturday morning, just as the sun was coming out of hiding after a downpour. Fumi had travelled to visit relatives, and Akin kept following me around the house, asking for details about my treatment in the hospital. It was as though he knew that there was still a part of me that did not totally believe that the doctors were right. That morning, he had managed to question me until I screamed at him that it was possible that everyone was wrong and I was right. "You need to tell your doctor what you are really thinking," he'd said. "Stop saying what you think he wants to hear." I was happy to see Dotung, because I felt he would distract Akin. They enjoyed each other's company and spent hours on the phone arguing about sports, politics, and the weather. Sometimes when Akin thought I was not listening, I overheard them discussing which was better, a busty woman or one with a really round ass. I assumed that with Dotung around, Akin would ease off the pressure he was putting on me.
"I am here, oh!"
Dotung yelled when I opened the door. He pushed me aside to lunge at his brother. They embraced, and then Dotung stepped back and bowed.
"Brother me."
Akin was so tall that he always had to bend before passing through a doorway. His skin was bronze brown, and in the sun it took on a glossy sheen. Dotung was the same height as my husband, but he was fair-complexioned and lean, with cheeks that looked as if they had been hollowed out. I knelt down to greet him. We were the same age, but because he was my in-law, I was expected to treat him as though he was older than me. I believed he was a typical Oniranu, a totally irresponsible man, but I gave him due respect every time he came around. "Welcome, sir. I hope you have had a good journey," I said. Dotung settled into an armchair, stretching his legs out on the mahogany center table.
"My wife sends her greetings. She's on a night shift this weekend. I can't handle the boys on my own. Their fighting would have convinced me to drive into a tree on the way here, so they are in Lagos. How did our mother survive with us? This is payback time for me. The boys are with their aunts, my wife's sister. Yejide, I hear you have become two in one. You have swallowed a human being. Come, let me see you clearly."
I stood in front of my brother-in-law, and then turned around for inspection. The smile that had been sitting on my husband's face since Dotung showed up fell off his lips.
"She is not pregnant," Akin said. "She has a condition. She's seen a doctor." "But Mommy said,"
Dotung began. "I am pregnant," I said, clutching my tummy, willing the baby to kick at that time, willing it to prove itself to me, to everyone in the room, and put a permanent end to Akin's unbelief.
"Brother me, it is a woman that will say if she's pregnant," Dotung said. "Ask her how long she has been pregnant," Akin said. Dotung focused his gaze on my belly, squinting as though I had somehow shrunk, and he had to try really hard to see me. "Akin, you can't tell me what I'm feeling in my body."
Akin stood up and grabbed my shoulders.
You have been sent away from antenatal classes yesterday. You had 5 scans, 5 different doctors in Elisha, Ife, and Ibadan. You are not pregnant. You are delusional.
Saliva foamed from the sides of his mouth.
Ejide, this has to stop. Please, I beg you. Dotun, please talk to her. I have talked and talked. My mouth is starting to peel off because of all the talking.
His hands were hurting my shoulders. Dotun's mouth was open. He closed it and opened it again. I had never seen him speechless.
What do doctors know anyway?
Dotun said when his voice returned to him from its wandering.
It is a woman that knows if she is pregnant or not.
He believed me. There was no mockery, no doubt in his eyes. They met mine evenly. His eyes held something I hadn't seen in Akin's eyes for so long, for far too long. Faith in me. In my words, in my sanity. I wanted to hug Dotun close to me until his faith in me restored my dwindling hope and drove away the familiar despair that was eating me up.
Your brain is melting, Yejide. It is melting,
Akin said.
Dotun, I'm tired of reasoning with this crazy woman. I'm going to the club. Are you coming?
He had never spoken to me like that before. His words would replay themselves to me for weeks and cause me to cringe each time.
Your brain is melting, Yejide. It is melting, melting.
Dotun started to say something in my defense, but I didn't wait to listen. I pressed my palms against my stomach and stumbled up the stairs, blinded by tears. As I entered our bedroom, I could hear Akin's car pulling out of the front yard. Sometimes I think my husband's words made it easier for me to let Dotun comfort me. I think they made me weak enough to lean against him as he held me while I wept, as he kissed my earlobes and took off my clothes. It was over before I could blink, leaving me with semen and a dry ache between my thighs. I felt a strong sense of pity for my poor sister-in-law.
Was this it? All she got out of Dotun week in, week out?
I had at least expected to feel more, a tingle at the very least in spite of myself, even if it was against all I thought I believed in. Until that weekend.
It will be better next time. I'll be better. You are too beautiful, you. I've always thought,
Dotun said as he pulled on his trousers hastily. And even as I tried to deny the knowledge, I knew there would be a next time. There was something different about being with him, something fuller. I wanted to try it again. My first instinct was to tell Akin. But how does one tell one's husband, "I want you to fuck me the way your brother did"? I hid in the room for the rest of the weekend. I left the door open so I could hear Akin and Dotun laughing, or hear their voices rising in disagreement. I heard nothing. All was quiet downstairs. The silence was a presence that reached up to punch me hard in the stomach, until I lost my miracle baby in a flood of guilty tears. When he came to bed on Sunday night, Akin found me curled up. I was moaning, "My baby, my baby." He stood by the door. I was sure he would not come near me, that he would walk out. I was sure his brother's hands had left prints on my skin, prints that shone for my husband to see under the fluorescent tube that lit our room, prints that the hot showers I had taken would not wash away. Akin closed the door, removed his shirt and singlet, carefully folded them at the foot of the bed, and lay down beside me. He stretched out my limbs, trailing the tips of his fingers over my skin.
"I'm sorry,"
he said.
"I'm so sorry."
He whispered my name.
Yejide. Yejide.
It was so soft on his lips, an exotic sound that was a caress in itself. I wanted him to know what I could not say, that my baby, the pregnancy I had nursed, was gone. Gone. I was empty again. He kissed my face until I started moaning his name instead. I wanted to run downstairs to Dotun, to tell him, see what Akin can make me feel on just my face. See? He whispered my name, his breath hot against my skin. I shivered and covered his lips with mine. He moved to my neck and I shut my eyes. This time, I could not drown in the tingly sensations his tongue and fingers gave. Pleasure was suspended by my fierce hope that everything would be perfect, positioned just right for me to conceive. Dotun left on Monday morning. His hand lingered too long on my shoulder when he said goodbye, and I wondered if I saw Akin grind his jaw as we both waved at Dotun's departing car. Chapter 14. When they finally came, the armed robbers sounded like a group of men who were lost and had come into our sitting room to ask for directions. They spoke impeccable English, sat in chairs like visitors, and requested something to drink. No alcohol on duty, please. Then they pointed a gun at each of our heads and asked us to pack up all our electronics. Initially, it was more of a visit than an attack. One of the men even said thank you when he was done with his bottle of limca. Then a few minutes after Akin, Fumi and I went back into the house, after we had loaded our electronics into their van, we heard a gunshot, then a scream that punched holes into the silent night. Several gunshots followed, leaving echoes that would keep residents of the estate awake with sweaty faces and dry mouths for months to come. Akin pushed me down after the first gunshot and threw his body over mine. We stayed that way, trying our best not to breathe loudly. I was aware that Fumi was somewhere in the sitting room too. She whimpered until Akin told her to shut up. We stayed on the ground until dawn. Akin did not shift once, not even when Fumi asked him if he did not care about protecting her too. When we stood up in the morning, Fumi began to sob. "You don't love me," she said to Akin. "You don't care at all." Akin didn't reply. He asked me if I was okay and went outside to check on our neighbors. I went upstairs, leaving Fumi alone in the sitting room. It turned out that the shots had all been fired into furniture, walls, and car windows. No one had been hurt, although Mr. Fatola fainted the minute robbers entered his home. He came to after the robbers had left, and his wife poured a cup of ice-cold water on his face. The estate committee wrote a petition to the police station at Ayeso. When the hired hunters informed us after the robbery that none of the policemen had shown up for work the day the robbery took place. After they said this, Mrs. Ojo announced in her British accent that one of the policemen had been among the thieves. No one paid her any attention. It was obvious the police were involved in some way, but that they would take up arms against us themselves? We did not think things had become that bad, yet. While Iabolu worried about the robbers, I had better things on my mind. My stomach was bulging with child. Even the ultrasound machines agreed this time. I tucked the glossy scan result under the wooden frame of my mirror, at the top corner, where I could see it when I combed my hair every morning. I ate fruits, and Akin cooked vegetable stew for me every night. There were stones in it most times, but I did not complain. I refused to change my wardrobe so that the pregnancy would strain against my too tight clothes. I kept this up until a dress ripped from armpit to knee as I rose up to join the congregation in sharing the grace at a Sunday service. I became known as the pregnant woman with the ripped dress, even after the baby was born. But I did not care that people pointed and smiled behind their hands during a hymn or the Nicene Creed at the church. I had become immortal, part of a never-ending chain of life. New life kicked within me, and soon I would have someone that I could call my own. Not a stepmother or half-brother, not a father shared with 24 other children, or a husband shared with Fumi, but a child. My child. These thoughts filled me with so much happiness that I was gripped with fear. It seemed too much that any human being should be so happy and fortunate. More than once, in the early months of pregnancy, I would take my hands off the steering wheel while driving and place them over my belly, splaying my palms to cover as much of the belly as they could. I tried to hold the baby in, lest in a wave of misfortune that my infinite joy of those months had me overdue for, the baby burst to the floor of my Volkswagen and left my stomach hanging open. The hoots of horns and curses from other motorists reminded me that an accident would be a surer way to lose the baby. To my amazement, I was never involved in an accident during my tummy-clutching moments. This reaffirmed my belief that bad luck would soon come knocking, that my happy life was too good to be true and would soon come crashing down on my head. I set about blocking off all possible avenues for bad luck. I became nice to Fumi, shared tips about Akin, from his favourite shade of lipstick, a bright red that would look garish on her, to how he liked his beans, watery and with lots of pepper. I was ready to share. A man is not something you can hoard to yourself. He can have many wives, but a child can have only one real mother. One. Against my worst imaginings, the pregnancy was smooth. The doctors were happy every time I went in for an examination, and by the 3rd trimester, my anxiety disappeared and I settled in to enjoy the pregnancy. I loved the aching back. I bragged about the enormity of my feet and complained incessantly about how difficult it was to find a sleeping position. It was the best time of my life. Chapter 15. We called the baby Olamide and 20 other names. She was soft yellow and turned pink in the face when she cried, which was almost all the time, except when a nipple was stuck in her mouth. Her ears were a shade of brown that matched the back of Akin's hands. Moomi assured us that Akin had been that way too, and soon our pretty girl would ripen from soft yellow to the brown shade of her ears. The naming ceremony was a carnival. Olamide had been born on a Saturday, the most convenient day of the week. Her naming ceremony 7 days later was attended by hundreds of people, as it didn't have to compete with working hours or a Sunday service. My stepmothers arrived on Friday. They came, wearing smiles to mask the disappointment that lurked in the corners of their eyes. They peered into the cot where Olamide lay, as though expecting to discover a pillow wrapped in a shawl instead of a baby. They gushed appropriately about how happy they were and mentioned names of pastors and priests they had visited to pray for me to conceive. I acknowledged their lies with an appreciative smile, then herded them out of my bedroom before they could actually touch my child. Dotun came down from Lagos with his wife and children. They arrived before the ceremony, about the time the DJ was whispering, "Testing, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, into the microphone. I was in the bedroom, sitting on a bucket that contained a mixture of hot water, alum, and antiseptic, wondering why all the masters of ceremony had to say those words and never something else. Moomi was standing guard to make sure that I did not stand up until enough steam had entered my vagina to tighten the walls. Moomi cackled. "Not long now. Akin's fingers will start probing under your wrapper in the dark again." I wished for more than her son's fingers to probe at that later date, but I did not share this with my mother-in-law, whose thinly veiled references to sex were already making me uncomfortable. It should have been a relief when Dotun's wife came in, liberating me from Moomi's hypotheses about her son's sexual prowess and offering me a reason to escape the steam that was making my sore vagina burn as though red pepper had been shoved into it. Instead, the heat in me increased as I rose to hug my weeping sister-in-law. Ajoke sobbed into my bare shoulder, and I gripped her hand, afraid that she would break loose and pour the alum water mixture on my head. Surely she knew, and I was doomed to disgrace on the happiest day of my life. She pulled back and laughed a peculiar laugh that always seemed to come from every part of her being, right from her toes up until it erupted from her mouth. "The Lord is good. Our God is so good." She smiled, her eyes full of pure joy and relief that mirrored what I felt in the first moment I held my daughter in my arms. Ajoke had never said anything to me at family gatherings about a baby. She was a woman who hardly ever said anything to me or anyone at all. I was surprised and shamed by her unusual display of emotion. I hugged her again so she could not see my eyes. Maomi joined in the loose hug. I was surrounded by their laughter and mine. Ajoke made delighted sounds that pricked me like a fork. Olamide yelled throughout the naming ceremony, and if there hadn't been a microphone, nobody would have heard the vicar call out her names. I went back upstairs to feed her until she slept. Downstairs, the party continued until the early hours of the morning. Long after the live band had stopped performing, food and beer flowed until most of the guests dropped off to sleep on the blue metal chairs. I did not join in the festivities, even when a drunken Akin sang love songs and tried to drag me downstairs with him. I was not ready to leave my child with someone else, not even my mother-in-law. I thought of my mother. If she had been alive, I could have given Olamide to her and gone downstairs to dance. The next morning, Olamide was the first to wake up in the house. Her cries startled me out of my sleep. I bathed her and breastfed her. She soon fell asleep, still suckling at my breast. I waited for her mouth to loosen its grip on my nipple before tying her to my back with a wrapper. Then I went downstairs to find something to eat. I screamed as my feet hit the first step. I staggered downstairs, still screaming, holding onto the banister for support. At the bottom of our flight of stairs, Funmi lay lifeless. She was dressed in a pink nightgown unlike anything I had ever seen before. It had only one strap on her left shoulder. The right side of the gown stopped at her navel, leaving her yellow breast bare. So this is all it takes to snatch a man from his wife's bed, I thought, even as I screamed for help and lifted Funmi's head from a small pool of blood. A bare yellow breast and a pink nightgown. Funmi's body was already cold. I shook my head and screamed her name. My mother-in-law raced downstairs with a wrapper tied haphazardly over her breasts. Akin and Ajoke were a few steps behind her.
What happened?
Maomi yelled, even though she was already standing beside me.
Funmi.
Akin was squinting at his wife, as if he didn't know who it was. His breath stank, like a mix of garlic and alcohol. Maomi knelt beside me, lifted Funmi's hand, and watched it fall heavily to the ground. She tried to force a finger through Funmi's clenched teeth, while calling the girl's name over and over.
Ah! I'm stuck. I'm now firmly stuck in a tight place,
Maomi said as she stood up. Then she threw her hands in the air and began to dance. She hit herself and shuffled left and right, bending her knees and screaming at intervals.
I have accrued a debt I cannot pay back. I am in trouble. Funmi, what do you want me to tell your mother? I am stuck.
It was Ajoke who thought to check Funmi's pulse and heartbeat. I clung to Akin as Ajoke bent over Funmi, digging my nails into his arm. Maomi continued to slap her head, but was quiet when Ajoke looked up at us. "She is gone," Ajoke said softly.
I'm in hot oil. Funmi, I'm in debt-o, eternal debt.
Maomi screamed and began to dance again.
What is going on?
We all turned to the staircase. Dotun stood at the top wearing only boxer shorts. I shut my eyes and wished Funmi had picked a better day to die, a day unattached to my Olamide's birth and naming ceremony. I wasn't supposed to think like that. I should have been sad. Instead, I felt inconvenienced, upstaged even, but not sad. Not at all. We changed the tiles in the sitting room because Funmi's blood wouldn't come out. Sometimes I stood at the base of the stairs where I'd found her body and stared upstairs. I half expected her to sashay downstairs one more time in the heels she wore around the house, with her footfall sounding like nails being driven into concrete. I kept expecting her to turn up on our doorstep, her hand held just so I could see her new manicure. Sometimes as I grated okra into a bowl of water, I could feel her eyes on the back of my neck. But she was never behind me when I turned around. It was just the kitchen door, swinging on its hinge. She wasn't in the room she had shared with my husband. Even her clothes were gone from the wardrobe. There were rows of naked hangers that her sister hadn't packed when she came for Funmi's things. The sister was a startling copy of Funmi, just a few inches taller. I needed a third look at her flat slippers to convince myself she was not Funmi in heels. She did not speak to anyone as she lugged her late sister's possessions out of our house. I was relieved when she left. I had been expecting drama, a slap or two on my cheek for outliving my rival. Surely that made me a suspect in Funmi's sudden death. I had been afraid someone would suggest I had pushed the poor girl down the stairs, but no one did. It was agreed that, groggy and probably drunk after Olamide's naming ceremony, Funmi had slipped on her way up the stairs at some point in the night. I didn't attend her funeral. Moomi believed it would enrage her family to see me. Akin attended, and apart from a moody evening he spent downing bottles of beer when he returned from the funeral, he did not seem to mourn Funmi's death at all. There was no staring into space, no angry outbursts at the newscasters on TV, or a stool that stood in his way, no long nights away from the house which ended with him staggering home and vomiting in the hallway. He spent his evenings singing made-up songs to Olamide and reading newspaper articles aloud to her. My daughter knew all about the proceedings of the Constitution Review Committee and the Constituent Assembly before she was 3 months old. It was the most beautiful thing, watching my husband tell my daughter things she could not understand. It was so perfect, so surreal, that I wanted to press the pause button on life in those moments. Funmi faded from my mind, slowly, like a bad dream. Soon Akin's hands were groping me in the early hours of the morning. He reached across Olamide's sleeping form to squeeze my breast, and whispered about us making another baby. And though by this time Moomi had poked 3 fingers into my vagina and assured me that it was tight enough before terminating the alum water treatment, I was not ready for sex. I told Akin this, but he ignored my words, seducing me with words of his own about how beautiful our lives would be with another child. I caved in, like I always did under the weight of his husky voice. Olamide would darken beyond Akin's brownness to my shade, my mother's shade, a midnight black that would glow ethereally in the fierce sun. She would get all the prizes, and I would stand up throughout the prize-giving ceremonies at her school, clapping loudly so that everyone would recognize her as my child. She would go on to university, of course, become a doctor or an engineer, an inventor, a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, chemistry, or physics. I could see all of this in her eyes when she suckled my breast, and I was already proud. Chapter 16. About a month after Olamide was born, I went to church for the first time since I had married Yejide. Stopped bothering with the Sunday services when I was at university, but I still showed up for Easter and Christmas celebrations before I got married. Hadn't been back in church on a Sunday morning since then, because I didn't think I had an extra hour in my week to spend sitting in a pew. But 2 weeks after my daughter was born, I started having nightmares again, dreaming up the same images from the protest march I joined in Ife in 81. Kept seeing the jeans-clad girl lying in the rain. Only difference was that this time I knew that each girl on the floor was Funmi. So I went back to church. I didn't sit in the back pew where many men, dragged to the Sunday service by nagging wives, dozed with their mouths open or read newspapers. I went as close to the front row as I could get, sat in a pew where I had a clear view of the stained glass windows behind the altar. The glassy scene showed Christ and the 12 at the Last Supper, 11 disciples at the table, the 12th, presumably Judas, already on his way out, his back to Christ. When the vicar mounted the pulpit, the old woman to my right hung her head as though about to pray. Soon, she started to snore softly. The vicar began his sermon by reading out the Lord's Prayer from the massive Bible that resided permanently on the marble pulpit. He stopped at, "Deliver us from evil," and breathed heavily into the microphone. He whispered the words, repeating the line over and over, pausing after each word, his voice rising with each repetition until he was shouting into the microphone, "But deliver us from evil." Beside me, the old woman was startled out of her sleep. She looked around the church, then rested her chin on her chest again. "We often ask the Lord to deliver us from evil," the vicar said, "and we should. However, we must also consider the unspeakable evils that we seek out by ourselves. What are we doing about the terrible evils that we can deliver ourselves from? Why must we always wait for the Lord when we are perpetrating so much evil with our own hands? Have we stopped to think about the evil we deliver into the world? The list is endless, but let me try to remind you: adultery, sloth, envy, jealousy, bitterness, anger, drunkenness." The vicar's eyes roamed the rows as he spoke. Our eyes met when he mentioned drunkenness, as if he knew something about me, something hidden, secret. His gaze lingered on me. Maybe he wanted my heart to quiver. I shook my head from side to side slowly, as I imagined saints did when they heard all about the sins of the worldly. Fact is, I'm not a drunkard. I don't drink a lot. There are months when I don't take any alcohol, not even a glass of wine. If I had to count the number of times I've been drunk during my whole life, you could count them all on one hand. First time I got drunk, I was a teenager. At the time, my father would send me to buy him a gourd of fresh palm wine every evening. Dotun often went with me. On our way back home, we'd drink a bit of the wine and chew raw ewedu leaves to get rid of the smell before we got into the house. One day we decided to drink everything in the gourd. The plan was to tell Baba that we'd been attacked by rogues who had snatched the gourd from us. That was the last time Baba sent us to get palm wine. According to Moomi, Dotun and I arrived on our street, drunk, beating the gourd, singing church hymns. We went past our home, marched into our neighbor's compound, calling for lost souls to repent. Moomi blamed Baba for sending her young children to buy alcohol. He blamed her for raising boys who couldn't keep their drink down. The argument lasted the whole year, dying down to rise again at unexpected moments in Moomi's shrill voice and Baba's studied silence. Moomi ripped our buttocks with a stick every day for a week, extracting a promise not to touch alcohol until we died with each stroke. She gave me double the number of strokes Dotun got, reminded me that she expected more from me because I was her firstborn son, the beginning of his strength. I discovered beer during the next week. Best thing about it was that Moomi couldn't recognize the smell on our breath because Baba didn't drink it at the time. Dotun and I would pour beer into plastic cups, then drink under Moomi's nose and tell her that we were sharing a bottle of malt. As the vicar continued his sermon that Sunday, I made a note in my jotter to get a crate of beer ready for Dotun's next visit. He planned to stop over in Ilesha for a few days on his way to Abuja at some point in the next couple of weeks. When I glanced up, I didn't look at the vicar, stared instead at the stained glass windows, struck for the first time by Judas's downturned lips. I wondered if he already regretted what he was about to do. I had regrets that Sunday morning, about getting drunk during Olamide's naming ceremony. I had had my first beer after Dotun arrived from Lagos with his family around 10 in the morning, just before the ceremony began. I'd stood in the storeroom beside the kitchen, the place where nobody would have looked for me, swallowed gulp after gulp of warm beer until I'd emptied 3 brown bottles back to back. It was easier to smile when I rejoined the crowd that had gathered in our home to celebrate with Yejide and me. Even then, my words were not slurred when I read out the 21 names that Olamide would bear. Each name was a contribution from a key member of the family. Even Yejide's stepmothers contributed names. Olamide was Yejide's choice. but everyone thought it was my choice since it was the first name I called out. But I did not give that child any name. Not one. The beer made the names roll off my tongue as if they were names whose layers of meaning I, father of the child, had pondered upon before agreeing to include them on the handwritten list that I read from. It was so much easier to be a father after 3 bottles of beer. Everyone was congratulating me. They called me Baba Aburo, Baba Ikoko, Baba Baby. Then after the names had been given, Baba Olamide. Colleagues slapped me on the back, told me that the next baby had to be a boy. Friends said I had allowed Yejide to start with an easy hand by having a girl. Next, it was time for a boy. Better still, boys. 2, 3, 4 boys, as many as I could knock into her at once. Then somebody remembered Funmi, remembered that I was now pulling double duty. My colleagues and friends decided that I needed reinforcement, the kind any man would need if faced with the task of getting 2 beautiful women pregnant with boys. It was time to start getting ready, one of my friends said. We were all seated around a metal table beneath the large tarpaulin tent that was used for the naming ceremony. We were drinking beer and eating fried meat as the conversation took place. I was not as drunk as most people at the table when Dotun suggested that I should drink several bottles of Odeku in preparation for the task ahead. It was Dotun who then brought the crate of stout to our table. He handed me the first brown bottle while the other men at the table chanted, Odeku, Odeku, Odeku. The men stood up to hand me the subsequent bottles, as though each one was a gift, their own contribution to solidifying my virility and populating my family with enough children to make up for the years when quite a number of them had asked me to do something about the barren woman in my house. They gave me bottle after bottle, cheered me on each time I slammed an empty brown bottle on the table like a warlord returning from battle, holding an opponent's head. I don't remember how Funmi came to join us at that table, how she too became involved in the drunken preparation for the task of filling our house with a dozen children. But soon enough, Funmi and I were swapping beer bottles, laughing like fools. That day was the first time I saw Funmi drink stout. No, drunkenness has never been a problem for me or the women in my life, and as the vicar began to wrap up his sermon that Sunday about a month after Funmi died, I decided that drunkenness was not something I needed to be delivered from. Perhaps when we ask the Lord to deliver us from evil, we are really asking him to deliver us from ourselves. The vicar wiped his forehead with a white handkerchief. I admonish you today to deliver yourself from every evil that you have brought into your life with your own hands. Let us now bow our heads for prayers. I tried to shut my eyes and pray, but I couldn't stop thinking about Funmi. I could see her clearly as I studied the stained glass. I could hear her final yelp, see the way her hands tried to grab the banister after I pushed her down the stairs. Chapter 17.